Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. With Mexico's election of a leftist president, there have been a lot of dire predictions that U.S.-Mexico relations will deteriorate even further. Mexico can't ignore the United States. Its relationship is fundamental to the economy and also to a wide range of issues, from immigration to trade to security, that affect the daily lives of Mexicans. Today, to talk about the binational relationship, we're very pleased to have here in the studio Alex Main. Alex is the Director of International Policy with the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Great to be on your show.
Alex, Donald Trump was one of the first world leaders to call Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador and congratulate him after the elections. Were you surprised about that?
So it was a bit of a surprise knowing the personality of Donald Trump.
And his attitude toward Mexico.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, normally it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, normally it is, the U.S. head of state who is very quick at congratulating the victor in Mexico. I mean, that's what we've seen in the past. And it's obviously a vital relationship. I mean, there's so much cooperation on this, very long border that they share on security issues, on trade issues. But of course, Donald Trump has had extremely aggressive rhetoric towards Mexico. And he has surely been briefed a little bit on who he's dealing with now. And that Lopez Obrador is someone who's had some very strong positions against Trump's own agenda against migrants and the way he's obviously characterized in really a racist, xenophobic manner, Mexican immigrants and so on. So he's aware of all that, and yet he did reach out, and I think that's obviously a good thing, but we have to wonder a little bit what's behind that. And we did see prior to the official victory of Lopez Obrador, and prior to this phone call, we saw statements from people in the U.S. administration.
Yeah, that's right, that were saying we don't want to see a Lopez Obrador presidency. And in fact, your group even was concerned about that at one point and called formally on the U.S. government not to intervene in these elections.
Well,
is that right?
Absolutely. A lot of people did. That was, however, 2 or 3 months ago. The U.S. was trying to foment rumors that Russia was intervening in the Mexican elections in order to favor Lopez Obrador. Obviously, there was no evidence of this. In fact, if anything, all the fake news was directed against Lopez Obrador's candidacy. So more recently, you've had John Bolton, who's the new national security advisor.
A hawk,
President
if there
Trump.
ever was one.
Absolutely. I mean, a big neoconservative who's who wants really to have a very aggressive position towards Iran, for instance, also very aggressive towards Venezuela. And he certainly was, when he was obviously a senior diplomat in the George W. Bush administration. We could only expect the worst from him, and yet he himself was sending positive signals out saying that, Lopez Obrador was a different sort of leftist that the U.S. could work with. And I think they're making a sort of a bet. They are very single-minded in terms of their geopolitical agenda in Latin America, and it really involves going after Venezuela first, and then, as a secondary goal, going after Cuba, which has obviously always been on the U.S. agenda. But what they've been trying to do, and what really the big campaign that the Trump administration has had in Latin America, is rounding up allies to go after the Venezuelan government, to try to undermine them with sanctions, for instance, to try to isolate them multilaterally. And I think this is one of the things that they're hoping to achieve with Lopez Obrador. And I very much doubt that they will be successful in doing that. But I think that's the sort of gamble that they have at this time.
Apart from the difference in ideology, I mean, we had a neoliberal government that was willing to play that game, that would often show up alongside the United States with the Colombian government, sometimes in the Organization of American States, to support that agenda. Lopez Obrador hasn't said a lot about Venezuela in particular, but he has said repeatedly that Mexico will go back to what's traditionally been its foreign policy of neutrality, which would indicate in itself that it's a little more reticent to play that role that the United States has demanded of the Mexican government.
That's right. He's put a lot of emphasis on these themes in his closing speech of his campaign, also in his victory speech. He mentioned the importance of promoting the principles of non-intervention, peaceful resolution of conflicts. And he also openly opposed hegemony, and he used that word. And I think it was very clear to Mexicans who he was referring to the big neighbor of the north. That is certainly the hegemon in the region. And that he said that Mexico would not go along with a hegemonic agenda. So I think this has sent out a strong signal. I think the U.S. is hoping that he will, as previous governments have, go along with the U.S. agenda in the region. But I think we're about to see a big shift.
And then in the first few days after the elections, there was a supposedly half-hour phone conversation between Donald Trump and Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, talking about everything they said, from border security to the issues that we mentioned, including immigration. Apparently, we don't know what the content of that phone call was. But again, these messages of cordiality, we've heard Lopez Obrador say that he's not going to pick a fight with the United States. I mean, where do you think this is going? Because there's certainly a number of issues on which there could easily be differences of opinion.
Well, I think, both leaders, to the extent that both leaders are entirely rational about their national interests, and I question that with the case of President Trump, but both leaders really have an interest in setting off on the right foot in the relationship. They both, really need each other for what's coming up. And of course, the big thing is the NAFTA renegotiation. And here, the Peña Nieto outgoing government has, had varying positions, but in general has, found sort of common ground, I think, with the Trump administration to a large extent, maybe to a greater extent than a lot of Mexicans would have liked to see. And I think, both would like to see a negotiation that's fruitful for both countries. Whether that's something that can be achieved is another question.
That's been one of the things that's interesting, because meanwhile, while Washington is sort of hoping that they're going to get our kind of leftist with Lopez Obrador, of course in Mexico there's expectations that there'll be quite a change in the policies of the past. And at the same time, on a number of these issues, we're finding almost by accident that they're points of agreement. Let's look at those issues one by one. Let's start with immigration, because it's been in the forefront of the news and certainly at the forefront of most of the frictions in the bilateral relationship since Donald Trump's campaign, even before he became president, with the wall and all of his border talk against Mexico. What can we expect there? What points do they have in common, and what are going to be the sticking points?
Well, yeah, this is where I see sort of a point of contention between both governments coming up fairly quickly after Lopez Obrador becomes president in December. But, certainly Trump obviously has given conflicting signals, but he has indicated that he wants to see some sort of major immigration reform that he knows has to involve Democrats, that he knows has to involve sort of integrating, the dreamers and other undocumented workers in the U.S. I think this is something that's certainly readily accepted by most of the business elite in the United States, that this needs to happen, and it's filtered down to most of the Republican leadership. And so in terms of that, there should be some common ground that they can find as well. But in terms of treatment of migrants, and we're unlikely to see much improvement there. I mean, President Trump has obviously been defending the family separations. He finally had to back down. He's a big defender of the very aggressive policies of the Department of Homeland Security against immigrants. And this is an issue where Lopez Obrador has had very strong stances defending the human rights of these migrants. And at some point, he's going to have to take, I think, a strong stand against the Trump administration when it continues to violate the human rights of these immigrants.
Typically what Mexican presidents say is that there's not a lot we can do because this is a domestic policy issue, although it's clearly a foreign issue as well. It's always framed in the United States as a domestic policy issue having to do with national security. However, the other part of it in which Mexican government could do considerable amount is the Mexico southern border. The United States is funding the crackdown there on Central American migrants through the Merida initiative. Do you expect any changes, and what would happen if Mexico were to say, we're not going to do your dirty work anymore?
Well, yes, that's right. What we've been seeing is, and particularly since 2014, when the Plan Frontera Sur, the southern border plan, was launched in Mexico with support from the U.S., with direct financial support, in fact. As you said,
and a great deal of encouragement.
That's right. Mexico has been doing the dirty work. They have been militarizing that area, the southern portion of Mexico, bordering Guatemala. They have created these huge detention centers with absolutely horrible conditions in which migrants are being kept.
Massive deportations.
Massive deportations. They've been doing everything to discourage amnesty requests. And sending people back to very dangerous situations in Guatemala and Honduras and so on. And Lopez Obrador has opposed this. Again, this is the violation of migrants, this time migrants within Mexico. And it's something that the Mexican government has done in order to, I think, get everything that they can from the United States in terms of security assistance and so on, and that's another issue as well, where I think there could be some. What
kind of cooperation do you anticipate or not on the war on drugs?
Well, this is the other big issue. I mean, Lopez Obrador was elected on a commitment to really deal with the violence, and he's been opposed to the war on drugs in its current form, which obviously since the Merida Initiative, the U.S.-backed Merida Initiative in 2008, has involved militarization of law enforcement vis-a-vis drug trafficking, and has obviously it's been a period of enormous bloodshed in Mexico, and Mexicans are done with that, and that's one of the reasons that many of them voted for Lopez Obrador. And so he's going to have to revise this cooperation agreement, and this will be very sticky indeed, because the U.S. is now deep into the security apparatus of Mexico and the intelligence apparatus. It's not just the financial help, it's their very presence in the C4, for instance, the 4 Cs, the communication, control, and commando centers, where the U.S. has helped set these things up. These are interagency sort of intelligence gathering units that track, basically everything that the security forces are doing around the country. The U.S. is very deep in there. They have extraordinary intelligence assets in Mexico, and that's not something that they're going to give up easily. So we can expect a tough battle ahead in Lopez Obrador's efforts to try to change this war on drugs.
Is that level of involvement, especially in security, as something as sensitive as security, when the United States government has actually been historically the greatest security threat to Mexico, it has been something that's raised repeated protests on the basis of national sovereignty. We know that national sovereignty is really one of the pillars of what Lopez Obrador talked about during his campaign. So we could anticipate perhaps a clash there, you think?
Yes, absolutely. And on other issues as well, Lopez Obrador has also made it clear that he wants to diversify national industries, and he wants to revive key sectors of Mexican agriculture, for instance. And this is going to clash with, of course, the U.S.'s own interests or perceived interests within the NAFTA agreement, where, obviously a huge amount of imports to Mexico coming from U.S. agriculture have really displaced Mexican farmers and so on. So here, Lopez Obrador, in order to be successful, has to subsidize these sectors, and that's something that the U.S. is going to oppose, I think, very, very aggressively. So as much as I think Lopez Obrador would like to have the best of relations with the U.S., I think there are various aspects of his agenda that will clash with the U.S. agenda, or certainly the agenda of President Trump in Mexico.
There's a certain expectation on the part of the people that there be that type of clash, not in the sense of a confrontation, but that the kinds of changes that they're hoping for imply turning away from many of these policies that the United States government has had a major hand in imposing on Mexico over the years. So yeah, I think that it would be impossible to sail smoothly along that relationship and make those kinds of changes at the same time. Taking up the issue of trade, the Secretary of Economy basically said the first shots have been fired in a trade war when the Trump administration withdrew Mexico's exemption from the steel and aluminum tariffs. Do you think that there's a possibility of open trade war, or what do you anticipate in terms of the two governments now working out not just the renegotiation of NAFTA, but in general differences in the area of trade and investment, where it's called the most integrated region in the world?
Well, this is where it may be very difficult for Lopez Obrador going forward, because obviously the U.S. is by far Mexico's biggest export market. 80% of Mexico's exports now go to the U.S. And so its economy is very heavily reliant on continued U.S. consumption of Mexican products. I'm sure he will seek to diversify the economy a little bit more, as other Latin American countries have had and have done. And
stimulate the internal market.
Stimulate the internal market. Perhaps try to develop more trade relations with China, for instance, as has occurred, in South America. But it's going to be difficult. He's not going to have a huge margin of maneuver. But there are a few areas where they might be able to agree. And for instance, on the investor dispute settlement system that exists, I think you have people in the Trump administration and people also within the Lopez Obrador team that agree that you shouldn't put corporate rights above national rights, above the rights of the people of these countries. And that's what you basically have in NAFTA at the moment. And so, perhaps they can agree on, reforming that system, and that could be a positive thing. And there might be other areas of agreement, for instance, raising wages of Mexican workers,
yeah,
and obviously Lopez Obrador has really stood by that, and I'm sure it's something that he had to have brought up with President Trump if they discussed NAFTA even for 2 minutes. So, there are
Trump
ways.
sees it as a form of
it should help U.S. workers.
It
should help U.S. workers, because obviously if you have terribly unfair low wages in Mexico, a lot of good jobs end up being transferred to Mexico, and the idea is to have good jobs in both places. So there is, again, I think, an area of common ground here where hopefully they can work together. But there are going to be areas of contention, and again, developing the agricultural sector in Mexico is going to be a difficult process, given the amount of leverage that the U.S. has over the Mexican economy at the moment.
You mentioned other countries and the relations, other countries that have attempted some of these same kinds of changes. And the U.S.-Mexico relationship in the context of Latin America cannot be seen as an isolated relationship, because there's always distinct kinds of alliances that are being formed. How do you see this new relationship that will inevitably have to be developed between Lopez Obrador and Donald Trump, you know, two odd bedfellows if you look at it objectively. How do you see this having an impact and being affected by the geopolitics of the region?
Well, so far, Lopez Obrador has really not been very involved in the geopolitics of the region. He's someone, it's well known, he hasn't traveled very often. He isn't connected to much of the other left leadership in Latin America. And he hasn't had to play a foreign policy role. I mean, he's never had to do that. Certainly when he was mayor of Mexico City, that he of course had relations with other big cities, but it's not quite the same thing. Now he's going to have to do that, and very quickly, because Mexico is obviously a major player regionally and on the world stage as well, but certainly in the context of Latin America, Mexico has been a major partner of the U.S. in its own agenda, and in a lot of bad ways, I think, in a lot of ways that have not been good for Latin American democracy. And we've seen, for instance, how Mexico really supported the U.S. in its position of supporting the government of Honduras despite extremely flawed elections at the end of last year. And also how much Mexico has been involved in lobbying other countries and being involved in sort of the multilateral negotiations to isolate Venezuela and, you know, to try to sort of increase the pressure on Venezuela and sort of trying to undermine really the sovereignty of Venezuela in that process. So I think, you know, these are areas where Lopez Obrador is going to have to, you know, revise what the Mexican Foreign Ministry has been doing up to now. And I'm sure he's going to encounter a lot of resistance and a lot of pushback from the United States, and we'll have to see how he deals with that.
Yeah, when we go back to the point of so far what we do know being neutrality, which just even going back to that historical standard for Mexican foreign policy would be quite a change from what we've had in the last couple of decades.
Right.
The governments of Brazil, of Argentina to a certain extent, there's been a number of governments in the area that have attempted something that looks similar to what Lopez Obrador is talking about doing in Mexico now, a redistribution of wealth to some degree through social programs, cutting back on privileges of the elite, a balancing act between sectors of business and workers and grassroots organizations' interests. You've worked closely with some and studied many of those experiences in the last couple decades in Latin America. What's your evaluation of it?
Well,
is it possible, and especially is it possible with this huge hegemonic force called the United States kind of almost running the continent?
Well, each country has its own context and its own particularities. And so each sort of has a different story to tell in terms of how left governments have tried to become more independent from the United States and to develop autonomous economic policies, because obviously the United States historically has been very involved in imposing economic agendas throughout the region. And they really started to do this intensely in the late 70s, early 80s, through institutions like the International Monetary Fund, where, you know, basically a certain set of economic policies would be attached to loan agreements, so that countries couldn't get really, foreign funding without complying with, what's often called a neoliberal agenda that involved privatizations, enormous amount of deregulation. Inflation focus, a focus on inflation issues, and just
export-oriented
getting rid of trade barriers of all kinds and so on. And these policies didn't do much good in Latin America. In fact, it's something that my organization, Center for Economic and Policy Research, has looked at, and we see basically a 20-year period where these policies were imposed, where there was a lot of economic stagnation.
Well, you just did a report specifically on that regarding Mexico. What were some of the things that you found?
Well, sure. So, I mean, this agenda has been sort of imposed in Mexico since the early 80s, and both due to sort of the pressure of external forces, but also internally, the sort of ideology that was practiced by was sort of absorbed by various governments of that time, the technocrats,
U.S. trained,
that were U.S. trained and that themselves were convinced that these were the right agendas to pursue. And in Mexico, you know, we've seen certainly poverty go up. We've seen enormous economic stagnation. And it grew significantly worse with NAFTA, with the period following NAFTA. So even more economic stagnation, when of course NAFTA was signed with sort of a promise of enormous prosperity, lifting many people out of poverty and so on.
Joining the first world.
Exactly, and it's and you know, quite the contrary. Mexico has remained stuck, and in fact today the level of poverty is higher than when NAFTA was first signed in 1994.
And when you say stuck, you mean very low growth rates?
Extremely low growth over this period, and in recent years the growth rate has been around 1.5% on a per capita basis, which is very, very low. It's one of the worst growth rates in Latin America. I think Mexico at this point is about number 18 out of 20. Again, NAFTA was put into place with this huge promise for the Mexican people. And we've seen, you know, really negative effects in the long run. And I think this is another reason that the Mexican people have voted for Lopez Obrador. They want a shift away from these policies. We'll see if that is what Lopez Obrador is going to do. He has to do that while at the same time trying to sort of assuage the financial markets, the international financial markets, which have a huge influence on the Mexican economy, in part because the Mexican economy is become so open to foreign investment. And of course, foreign investment can be very fickle. It can come and go.
It makes you vulnerable.
And Mexico has very few controls. If investors want to leave, they can leave very quickly from Mexico. And this creates a very unstable situation.
Changing that in very specific terms. Well, there's certainly a mandate with this vote for changing fundamental aspects of that economic system. So it sets up an interesting panorama for the relationship with the United States. Alex Main, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Laura.
And thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.
An occasion to enjoy the cultural diversity that defines our South American essence. Come along to find out